My daughter slid a piece of paper across my old oak kitchen table. It wasn't a birthday card or a note. It was an invoice. Crisp, white, printed from a computer. It looked jarringly official sitting there next to my chipped ceramic mug. The paper made a soft, hissing sound as it came to a stop right in front of me. "For my care, Mom," she said. Clara's voice was level, almost rehearsed, like she was a consultant presenting a quarterly report. "Groceries, utilities, my time. It all adds up, you know." I didn't pick it up right away. I just looked at it. The black ink stood out against the stark white. Services rendered. There were itemized lines. Mileage for errands. 420 miles at $0.65 divided by mile. Hours of emotional support. 85 hours at $40 divided by hour. Contribution to household expenses. It was all there, neatly categorized, tallied up with a chilling precision. At the very bottom, in bold, was the final line. Total due, $24,750. My hands resting on the table didn't shake. I've learned to control my hands over the years. I looked up from the paper and into my daughter's eyes. She was waiting, her expression a mixture of feigned sympathy and firm expectation. She saw herself as modern, practical. She was setting boundaries. She was monetizing her affection. I remember thinking, in that brief, silent moment, that this was how it ended, not with a dramatic fight or a tearful goodbye, but with a bill, with the conversion of love into a line item. Slowly, I reached out and picked up the invoice. The paper was cool to the touch. I read it again. Every single word, every number. My breathing was even. Years of managing investments, of quietly building a life she knew nothing about, had taught me how to keep my composure when the stakes were high, and they had never been higher. "I see," I said, and my voice was quiet, so quiet it was almost a whisper. I folded the paper neatly in half and placed it beside my teacup. "A very detailed report. I'll take it into account." A small, satisfied smile touched Clara's lips. She'd gotten what she wanted. She'd made her point. She saw my calmness as acquiescence, my quietness as defeat. She believed I would go to my checkbook, like a dutiful old woman, and pay for the privilege of her company. She stood up, smoothed down her skirt, and walked to the door. "Just let me know when you've sorted it," she said, her tone light, as if we'd just discussed the weather. Then she was gone. The front door clicked shut, and the silence that rushed in was heavier than any sound I'd ever heard. The only noise was the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, each tick marking a second of my life that I would never get back, a second I had invested in a failed enterprise. She watched me like a creditor watches a debtor, but she didn't know that my entire life I had been keeping a different kind of ledger. It wasn't about money. It was a ledger of love, of kindness, of scraped knees I had kissed better, of sleepless nights I had sat by her bed, of the favorite meals I'd cooked without ever being asked. It was a ledger of shared laughter and quiet comfort, of 1,000 small sacrifices made willingly, joyfully, because that is what a mother does. And in that moment, looking at her invoice, I understood. This piece of paper wasn't just a demand for money. It was her declaration of spiritual bankruptcy. The tea in my cup was cold now. I didn't touch it. I sat there for a long time, watching the afternoon light fade in my quiet kitchen. Then I stood up, walked over to the telephone on the wall, and dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang twice. "George, it's Beatrice," I said. "Beatrice, how are you?" His voice was warm, familiar. George had been my lawyer for 30 years. He'd helped me set up the trusts, manage the portfolio my late husband left me, and grow it into something substantial. He was the only other person in the world who knew I was not just a quiet widow in a modest house, but a woman of considerable means. "I'm fine, George. I need to make a change to my will." "Of course," he said, his tone shifting to professional efficiency. "What did you have in mind?" "I want to update it," I said, my voice as calm and steady as a surgeon's hand. "My entire estate, all $2 million of it. My daughter, Clara, has just provided me with the final figures I needed for my calculations. Please write this down. I want the full amount to go to the local animal shelter. The one for stray cats down on Elm Street." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. I could picture George, his pen hovering over his legal pad. He didn't ask why. He never did. "And for my daughter?" he finally asked. "Ah, yes, for Clara," I said, looking at the neatly folded invoice still sitting on my table. "To my daughter, Clara, I leave the exact sum she billed me for today. $24,750. Not a cent more, not a cent less. She wanted a business transaction. She will get one." After I hung up the phone, the silence returned. But it was different now. It was no longer the heavy silence of grief. It was the clean, quiet silence of a decision made. I walked from the kitchen through the hallway, my footsteps echoing faintly on the hardwood floors. I stopped in front of the living room mirror. The woman looking back at me was 72 years old. There were lines on her face, a map of her years, but her eyes were clear. For the first time that day, I felt a single tear trace a path down my cheek. It wasn't a tear of self-pity or anger. It was a tear of mourning. It was a funeral tear for the little girl with scraped knees and bright, trusting eyes who used to run into my arms. The daughter I had loved was gone, and this cold, calculating woman had taken her place. I wiped the tear away with the back of my hand. The grief was a wave that had crested and now receded, leaving behind the hard, wet sand of resolve. I went into my study. It's a small room, filled with old books and the faint, pleasant smell of leather and paper. This was my sanctuary, the place where I managed my other life. I knelt down and opened the small, fireproof safe hidden behind a false panel of books. The heavy steel door swung open with a soft sigh. Inside, there were no jewels or stacks of cash, just neat, orderly folders, share certificates, property deeds for 2 small apartments I rented out, bond statements. The tangible proof of a life lived with prudence and foresight. My husband, Frank, had been a good man and a smart investor, and he had taught me well. After he passed, I took the modest nest egg he left, and I grew it, quietly, diligently, for 35 years. I did it for her, for Clara. I'd imagined the day I would reveal it all to her, the joy on her face, the security it would provide for her and her children, if she ever had them. I'd imagined it as my final gift of love. On top of all the folders lay a single, small, silver frame. I picked it up. It was a photograph of Clara when she was 5. She was sitting on my lap under the big oak tree in the backyard, her chubby arms wrapped tightly around my neck, her face buried in my shoulder. I was laughing, my head thrown back in pure, unadulterated joy. I could almost smell the freshly cut grass from that day, feel the summer sun on my skin, hear the sound of her small giggles in my ear. I stared at that photograph for a long time, at the woman I used to be, full of such simple, boundless love, at the child who took that love so freely, so innocently. Who was that woman with the invoice? Where did she come from? What had I done wrong? What seed of coldness had I failed to notice taking root in her heart? But the questions didn't matter anymore. The past was a closed book. The audit was complete. With a slow, deliberate movement, I turned the photograph over so the image was facing down. I placed it gently back on top of the financial documents, the silver back gleaming dully in the dim light of the study. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental. A final, quiet closing of an account. The emotional books were now balanced. The debt of love I had freely given had been called in, quantified, and I was now settling it in full. I closed the heavy door of the safe. The tumblers clicked into place with a satisfying finality. That chapter of my life was over. It was time to write a new one, a much, much quieter one, perhaps. One filled with the uncomplicated, honest affection of creatures who don't know how to write an invoice. The day I signed the new will was unusually bright. The sun streamed through the large windows in George's office, illuminating the fine dust motes dancing in the air. His office was a place of quiet dignity, dark wood, leather-bound books, the faint scent of old paper and Earl Grey tea. It was a room designed to absorb shock, to witness life-altering decisions with sober silence. George slid the document across his polished mahogany desk. 3 pages, typed in the dense, emotionless language of the law. I read every word, though I already knew what it said. My entire estate, tangible and intangible, I bequeath to the Elm Street Feline Sanctuary. The words seemed to float off the page, solid and real. This was it. The final stroke of the pen on a lifetime's ledger. "Are you certain, Beatrice?" George asked, his voice gentle. He wasn't questioning my judgment. He was performing his due diligence, giving me one last formal opportunity to turn back. He looked at me over the top of his spectacles, his eyes full of a kindness I had not seen in my own daughters. I picked up the heavy fountain pen he offered me. It felt cool and solid in my hand. I thought of Frank, my late husband. He always used a fountain pen. He said it made you think before you wrote, that the weight of it reminded you that words have consequences. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life, George," I said. My signature was firm, the ink a deep, definitive black against the cream-colored paper. Beatrice Eleanor Vance. A name, a decision, a final accounting. When it was done, and the witness, his quiet secretary, had signed her part, a strange sense of emptiness settled over me. For 40 years, my primary purpose had been Clara, raising her, supporting her, planning for her future. That purpose had been the engine of my life, and I had just turned it off. The silence it left behind was deafening. I drove home through familiar streets that suddenly felt alien. What does a woman of 72 do when she has just written off her only child? The days stretched before me, a long, empty road. The house, usually a place of comfort, felt cavernous. Every room held a memory of Clara, her first steps in the living room, the height chart we'd marked on the kitchen door frame, the faint scent of her perfume that still lingered in the guest room she used when she stayed over. They were ghosts now, memories of a person who no longer existed. I couldn't stay there. I got back in my car and just started driving. I don't know what guided me, but I found myself on Elm Street, parked across from a low, unassuming brick building. A simple, hand-painted sign read, "Elm Street Feline Sanctuary." I had never been inside before. I'd sent a small check every Christmas, a habit started by my husband, but I had never personally crossed its threshold. For a moment, I just sat in the car, watching. It looked a little tired. The paint on the sign was peeling, but there was life there. A young woman was scrubbing the front steps, and through the window, I could see the flick of a tail. Taking a breath, I got out of the car. The moment I opened the door, The smell hit me, a strange but not unpleasant mix of clean linen, disinfectant, and the warm, musky scent of animals. And beneath it all, the gentle, constant sound of purring. The main room was filled with cages, but most of them were open. Cats of all shapes and sizes were lounging on carpeted towers, batting at toys, or sleeping in sunbeams. A big, ginger Tom with one ragged ear blinked slowly at me from a worn-out armchair, as if I were a mildly interesting but ultimately unimportant event. "Can I help you?" A young woman with a kind smile and paint smudges on her cheek approached me. She was wiping her hands on her jeans. I'm not sure," I stammered, feeling foolish. "I just wanted to see." "Well, you've come to the right place for seeing," she laughed. "I'm Emily. I'm a volunteer here." She didn't ask for my name or a donation. She just gestured around the room. "This is the main colony. They're all free to roam. The new arrivals and the shy ones are in the quiet room in the back." I spent an hour there that first day. I didn't say much. I just walked around, letting a sleek black cat rub against my leg, watching two kittens tumble over each other in a basket. There was a sense of peace in that room, an uncomplicated honesty. These creatures didn't want anything from me except perhaps a gentle scratch behind the ears. They didn't present invoices. Their affection was not a service to be rendered. The next day, I came back. I brought 2 large bags of high-quality cat food. Emily's eyes widened when she saw them. "Oh my goodness, this is the good stuff. This is like a feast for them. Thank you so much." "Beatrice," I said. "Thank you, Beatrice," she said, and her gratitude was so genuine, so untainted by expectation, that it felt like a balm on a wound I didn't even know was still bleeding. My visits became a routine. I started coming 3, then 4 times a week. I learned the cats' names. There was Patches, the one-eared ginger Tom who appointed himself the official greeter. There was Shadow, a timid black cat who only came out when I sat quietly in the corner for at least 10 minutes. There was a litter of kittens, a chaotic bundle of fluff and energy who would climb all over me, their tiny claws snagging my sweater. I started talking more with Emily. She was a college student, studying to be a veterinarian. She worked 2 part-time jobs and still found 20 hours a week to volunteer at the shelter. She spoke about the animals with such fierce, protective love. She told me about their needs, the leaky roof in the quarantine room, the ancient washing machine that kept breaking down, the constant need for medicine and specialized food. One afternoon, I saw her staring at the old washing machine with a look of despair. "It's given up the ghost for good this time," she sighed. "We go through so many blankets and towels. I don't know how we'll keep everything clean." The next morning, a brand new, heavy-duty washer and dryer were delivered to the shelter. I had ordered them online, paid for them anonymously. But when I came in that afternoon, Emily rushed over and threw her arms around me. "It was you, wasn't it?" she whispered, her eyes shining with tears. "The delivery guy said it was paid for from a trust fund managed by a lawyer named George." I just smiled. For the first time in months, I felt a spark of something that wasn't grief or anger. It felt like purpose. This was a good investment. The return was immediate and clear. Warmth, cleanliness, comfort for creatures who had nothing. It was a nosy neighbor, Mildred, who reported my new activities to Clara. "I saw your mother, dear." I could just hear her syrupy voice over the phone, lugging bags of cat litter out of her car. At her age, and spending all that time in that dreadful, smelly place, you should really have a word with her. A week after the new will was signed, my doorbell rang. It wasn't a friendly, melodic chime. It was a sharp, impatient jab. I knew who it was before I even opened the door. Clara stood on my porch, her arms crossed, her face a mask of fury. The calm, businesslike woman was gone. In her place was a predator. "We need to talk," she said, pushing past me into the house. She marched into the living room and spun around to face me. "I get a call from Mildred telling me you're spending your days in some flea-bitten animal shelter. I come by to check on you, and what do I see? A receipt on your kitchen counter for $200 worth of cat food." $200! She was practically shouting. "I see you haven't paid me the money you owe me, but you have plenty to throw away on a bunch of stray cats. Are you losing your mind?" I stood by the doorway, my hand resting on the small table where I kept my keys. I said nothing. My silence only seemed to fuel her rage. "That's it," she declared, her eyes sweeping around the room, not at the family photos or the furniture we'd picked out together, but as if she were assessing its market value. "I see you're no longer capable of making sound financial decisions. I've already spoken to a realtor." My blood went cold. "A realtor?" I repeated, my voice barely audible. "Yes, we're selling this house." The words were like stones, hard and brutal. "It's too big for you anyway. You'll move into a smaller apartment, something more manageable. Under my supervision, of course. That way I can control your expenses and ensure you don't squander our inheritance on your little hobbies." Our inheritance. There it was, the truth, stripped of all pretense. The house wasn't my home. It was a future asset. My money wasn't mine to spend. It was hers, just waiting in my bank account. I wasn't her mother. I was a dragon, sitting on a pile of gold that she felt was rightfully hers, and I was starting to give it away. In that moment, any lingering trace of sorrow I had for the daughter I'd lost evaporated. It was replaced by something cold and hard and clear. Ice. It was the icy calm of absolute certainty. The woman standing in front of me was a stranger, a hostile entity who saw me not as a person, but as an obstacle to her financial gratification. My fingers, which had been resting on the table, found the house keys. My keys. The keys to the home Frank and I had built, the home where I had raised her, the last sovereign territory of my own life. My fingers closed around the cold, serrated metal, my knuckles turning white. I looked at her, really looked at her. And for the first time, I saw her not with a mother's love, clouded by memory and hope, but with the clear, assessing eyes of an adversary. She was threatening to take everything. My home, my autonomy, my dignity. She misinterpreted my silence as weakness, as the confusion of an old woman who could be easily managed. She took a step closer, her voice softening into a grotesque parody of concern. "It's for your own good, Mom. You'll see." I raised my head and met her gaze. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "This is my house, Clara," I said, and the words were quiet, but they filled the space between us with unshakable weight. I held up my hand, the keys clutched tightly within it. "And you are not selling it. You are not taking anything. You have no rights here." She stared at me, momentarily stunned by the steel in my voice. The confusion on her face quickly curdled back into anger. "We'll see about that," she sneered. "We'll just see what a lawyer has to say about your competence." She turned and stormed out, slamming the door so hard that a small picture frame on the wall rattled. I stood there for a long time after she was gone, the silence of the house ringing in my ears. I slowly uncurled my fingers. The edges of the keys had pressed deep indentations into my palm. This was no longer about a past hurt. It was about the present. It was about survival. She had made her move. Now, it was my turn to wait. The will was signed. The trap was set. All I had to do was live long enough to see it sprung. The silence that followed the slam of the door was a physical thing. It pressed in on me, thick and heavy. For a moment, I didn't move. I just stood there in my living room, my hand still clutching the keys, the metal now warm from my skin. The house around me, my home of 45 years, seemed to be holding its breath. This was a new kind of war. Clara's first attack, the invoice, had been an assault on my love. This second one, the threat to my home, was an assault on my life, my very autonomy. I knew then that I couldn't fight her on her own terms. A direct confrontation with that kind of ruthless greed was like trying to stop a tidal wave with a teacup. She would use my age, my supposed fragility, against me. She'd paint me as a confused old woman, incompetent and senile. And perhaps, a small, cold part of me admitted, some people would believe her. Arrogance, I thought, as I finally uncurled my aching fingers from the keys. That was her weakness. Her absolute, unshakable belief that she was smarter, stronger, and more entitled than anyone else in the room, especially her aging mother. She saw me as a problem to be managed, an asset to be liquidated. She didn't see me as a person anymore, which meant she would never see me as a threat. And in that blindness, I would find my weapon. I walked into the kitchen and sat down at the old oak table, the scene of the original crime. I poured myself a glass of water, my hands trembling slightly now that the adrenaline was fading. I had to play a role. I had to become the woman she already believed me to be, weak, frightened, and defeated. I had to let her win the battle, so I could win the war. I picked up the phone. My heart was pounding, not with fear, but with a strange, icy resolve. I was about to give the performance of my life. I took a deep, shuddering breath, consciously letting my shoulders slump. I practiced a small quiver in my voice when I said hello to the dial tone. Then I dialed Clara's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice sharp and impatient. "What?" "Clara," I began, letting my voice crack just a little. "It's me." "I know who it is. What do you want? Did you come to your senses?" "Please," I whispered, injecting a note of pleading that tasted like ash in my mouth. Don't call the realtor. Please, don't sell the house." There was a pause on the other end. I could practically hear the gears turning in her head, the smug satisfaction blooming in her chest. She had me. I was broken. "So you finally understand the situation," she said, her tone shifting to one of magnanimous, condescending control. "I knew you would. It's for the best, Mother." "You're right," I said, the words nearly choking me. "You were right all along. I've been foolish. The money, the invoice, I'll pay it. I'll pay all of it. Just tell me you won't take my home." The victory in her silence was deafening. "Of course, Mother," she said, her voice now syrupy with false compassion. "I told you. I'm just trying to take care of you. I'm glad you see that now. I'll come by tomorrow morning for the check." "I'll have it ready," I said, and hung up before she could say another word. I sat there, my hand still on the receiver, my body trembling with the sheer force of the deception. I felt soiled, degraded, but beneath the shame, a cold, hard certainty was taking root. She had swallowed the bait, hook, line, and sinker. The next morning, she arrived precisely at 10. She was dressed in a smart business suit, as if she were closing a major deal. And in her mind, she was. She walked in with an air of ownership, her eyes already mentally rearranging my furniture. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the checkbook in front of me. I didn't offer her tea. I didn't ask how she was. We were past such pleasantries. This was a transaction. "Good morning, Mother," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Clara," I replied, my voice quiet. I opened the checkbook. My hand was perfectly steady as I wrote the date. I wrote her name, Clara Vance, in the payee line. And then I wrote out the numbers. $24,750 and 0 over 100. I signed my name at the bottom, the same firm, steady signature I had put on my new will. I tore the check from the book along the perforated line. The sound was a sharp, satisfying rip. I pushed it across the table. It slid to a stop right in front of her. For a moment, it was a perfect mirror of her own gesture with the invoice. But this time, the roles were reversed. I was the one making the payment. I was the one closing the deal. She picked it up, her manicured fingers closing around the pale blue paper. She examined it closely, as if checking for forgery. A slow, triumphant smile spread across her face. This piece of paper was her trophy. It was proof of her victory, of my final, complete capitulation. "Thank you, Mother," she said, tucking it neatly into her expensive leather handbag. "I'm so glad we've come to an understanding. Now, I've made you a doctor's appointment for next week, a full checkup, and I'll be taking over your bill payments from now on, just to make sure everything is handled properly." She was so sure of herself, so confident in her absolute control. She saw an old woman who had just signed away a large sum of money out of fear. She had no idea she was looking at a general who had just sacrificed a pawn to protect the queen. "That's very thoughtful of you, Clara," I said, my voice flat. After she left, the house felt different again. The oppressive weight was gone. It had been replaced by a quiet, waiting calm. I had bought myself time. Now, I had to use it to build my fortress. The next day, I was back in George's office. The sun was shining again. I told him everything about Clara's threats, the realtor, her plan to take control of my finances. He listened patiently, his face a mask of professional neutrality, but I saw the anger simmering in his eyes. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. "She's left us no choice, Beatrice," he finally said, his voice grim. "She's shown her hand. Now we must protect your assets beyond any possible challenge." "What do you mean?" "The will is signed." "A will can be contested," he explained, leaning forward. "She could try to claim you were not of sound mind, that you were under duress or undue influence from this cat shelter. Given her recent actions, she will almost certainly try." A knot of ice formed in my stomach. "But," he continued, holding up a hand, "there is a stronger move, something that puts your most important asset, your home, completely beyond her reach, forever." He explained it to me then. A legal instrument called an irrevocable trust. It sounded complex, but the idea was simple and brutal in its elegance. "Think of it as a vault, Beatrice," he said, his voice clear and precise. "We create a legal entity, the trust. You then formally gift your house to this trust. You can continue to live in it, maintain it, be the sole beneficiary for the rest of your life, but legally, you no longer own it. The trust does, and the trust's only instruction, which cannot be changed by anyone, is that upon your passing, ownership transfers directly to the Elm Street Feline Sanctuary." He let that sink in. "Once the house is in the trust," he said, the finality of his words echoing in the quiet room, "it is no longer part of your estate. It cannot be claimed by creditors, it cannot be contested in the will, and it certainly cannot be sold by your daughter. It will be a legal ghost as far as she is concerned. She won't even know it's gone until it's too late. It was perfect. A silent, invisible shield that she would beat against in vain. It was the legal equivalent of turning my home into a fortress, with walls she couldn't see and a door she could never open. "Draw up the papers, George," I said, a profound sense of peace settling over me. The process took a few weeks. More papers to sign, more legal language to read. When it was all done, George handed me a thick folder. "There," he said, a rare small smile on his face. "It's done. Your home and your wishes are now armored. She can do nothing." Life settled into a strange new rhythm. Clara, flush with her victory and her $24,000, began her campaign of care. The phone calls started. 3 times a day. "Did you take your pills, Mother? What did you have for lunch? You shouldn't be driving at your age. I'll order your groceries for you." She would show up unannounced, a bag of bland, healthy food in her hand, her eyes scanning my home for any sign of decline. She was an warden disguised as a daughter. Every conversation was an interrogation, every suggestion a command. She was suffocating me with her concern, all the while waiting for me to die, confident that the prize was securely in her grasp. I played my part. I was forgetful. I was frail. I thanked her for her help. I allowed her to manage small aspects of my life. I let her believe she was in complete control. Every cloying phone call, every condescending visit was a turn of the screw, tightening the spring of the trap she couldn't see. And in between these performances, I would escape to my true life. I would go to the sanctuary. There, surrounded by the honest, uncomplicated affection of the cats and the genuine kindness of Emily, I could breathe. I would sit in the old armchair with Patches, the one-eared Tom, purring like a tiny engine on my lap. His presence was a solid, warm weight, a reminder that affection didn't need to come with a price tag. It was a gift, freely given. I was no longer a future inheritance or a problem to be managed. At the shelter, I was just Beatrice, and that was more than enough. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in deception. I moved through my days in a carefully constructed fog of frailty, playing the part of the cowed, compliant mother. Clara's calls, once a weekly chore, became a daily inquisition. Her visits, once perfunctory, were now inspections. She managed my online grocery orders, questioned my appointments, and spoke to me with the slow, deliberate condescension one uses for a difficult child. And I let her. I leaned into the role, nodding vaguely, appearing confused by bills, allowing her to believe she was consolidating her power over a crumbling mind. Each act of her suffocating care was a stone she laid on her own path to ruin. She was so blinded by her victory, so certain of the inheritance to come, that she never once saw the architect standing right in front of her, patiently watching her build her own prison. Meanwhile, my real life flourished in secret. My afternoons at the sanctuary became my salvation. I funded the repair of the leaky roof in the quarantine room. I set up a small monthly donation to cover the cost of veterinary care for the senior cats. I knew their names, their stories. I was no longer a visitor. I was part of the fabric of the place. Emily and the other volunteers had become my friends. They treated me not as a benefactor, but as one of their own. They valued my presence, not my purse. With them, I was not a failing asset. I was simply Beatrice. After 2 months of this strange, double life, I knew it was time. The trap was fully set. The legal walls of my fortress were impenetrable. Clara's arrogance had reached its zenith. It was time for the audit. I called her on a Tuesday morning. "Clara, dear," I said, my voice pitched to sound both weary and serious. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about the future, about arrangements. I think it's time we had a formal family discussion to make sure everything is clear." I could hear the change in her breathing, a quick, subtle intake of breath. This was it. The moment she'd been waiting for. "I've asked my lawyer George to be present," I continued, "just to ensure everything is properly documented and there are no misunderstandings down the line." The word lawyer was the magic key. It transformed a simple talk into the official anointing she so desperately craved. "Of course, Mother," she said, her voice smooth as cream. "That's very wise. When and where?" "My house. Friday, at 2 o'clock. "I'll be there," she said. I could hear the smile in her voice, the sound of a predator about to claim her prize. On Friday, I woke with a profound sense of calm. The house was clean, the air still. I dressed with care, not in the drab cardigans I wore for Clara's visits, but in a tailored navy blue dress. I put on the simple pearl earrings Frank had given me for our 25th anniversary. They were my armor. George arrived at 1:30. He carried a handsome leather briefcase that held the documents that would detonate Clara's world. He looked at me, a question in his kind eyes. "I'm ready, George," I said, and he simply nodded. We sat in the living room, the one she had mentally redecorated and appraised for sale. I had prepared a tray with a porcelain teapot and 3 cups, a final, ironic nod to a civility that no longer existed. On the polished coffee table between our chairs, George placed a single, thick, important-looking folder. At precisely 2 o'clock, the doorbell rang. When I opened it, Clara stood there, radiant. She was dressed in a vibrant red suit, a statement of power and victory. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless. She smelled of expensive perfume, a scent that seemed to invade my home. She wasn't coming for a family discussion. She was dressed for her coronation. "Mother," she beamed, kissing the air beside my cheek. "George, how wonderful to see you." She shook his hand with a confidence that bordered on condescension, as if he were now her employee as well. She swept into the living room and sat down on the sofa, placing her designer handbag beside her. She looked from me to George, then to the folder on the table, a hungry, expectant gleam in her eyes. I sat down opposite her. I poured the tea, my hands perfectly steady. The silence stretched, thick with her anticipation. "Clara," I began, my voice clear and calm, entirely devoid of the frail tremor she had grown used to. "Thank you for coming." She smiled and nodded, a queen granting an audience. "After you presented me with your invoice for services rendered a couple of months ago," I continued, "it prompted me to do some accounting of my own. I conducted a full audit of our relationship, my assets, and my future plans. I decided it was only fair to inform you of the results of that audit today, so there will be no surprises or confusion in the future." The word audit hung in the air. Her smile tightened ever so slightly. This wasn't the loving, grateful speech she had been expecting. I looked at George. "George, if you would." He opened the folder with a soft rustle of paper. He put on his reading glasses and looked at Clara, his expression impassive, the face of a man who was simply there to state the facts. "As per the final and legally binding last will and testament of your mother, Beatrice Vance, signed and witnessed on the 17th of April, he began, his voice a dispassionate drone. "Her estate is to be distributed as follows." He cleared his throat. Clause 1. To my daughter, Clara Vance, for her itemized services of care and support, I bequeath the sum specified in her invoice, dated the 15th of March. That is $24,750. Clara's face flooded with triumphant relief. She shot me a look, a mixture of smugness and pity. See? I won. She gave a small, satisfied nod to George, as if to say, continue with the formalities. But George didn't pause. He simply moved his finger down the page. Clause 2, he said, his voice unchanging. All remaining assets of my estate, including all savings, stocks, bonds, and personal effects, currently valued at approximately $2 million. He paused for a fraction of a second, letting the number land. Clara leaned forward, her eyes wide, her entire body thrumming with anticipation. I bequeath in their entirety to the Elm Street Feline Sanctuary. The world seemed to stop. The color drained from Clara's face, as if a plug had been pulled. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. It was the face of a person who had just been told the laws of gravity no longer applied. Furthermore, George continued, his tone relentless. Regarding the property at 12 Maple Lane, on the 3rd of May, Mrs. Vance placed this house into an irrevocable trust. For the duration of her life, she is the sole beneficiary. Upon her passing, the trust dictates that full and unencumbered ownership of the property transfers directly to the same beneficiary, the Elm Street Feline Sanctuary. He looked up, his gaze level. The house is not part of the estate. It is untouchable. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Clara made a sound, a short, strangled gasp. What? She whispered. Then, louder. What did you say? You heard him, Clara, I said, my voice quiet but firm. Her head snapped toward me, her eyes wild with disbelief and dawning fury. This is a joke. A sick, twisted joke. Mother, tell him it's a joke. It's no joke, I said calmly. You can't do this, she shrieked, jumping to her feet. The polished veneer had shattered, revealing the raw, ugly greed beneath. I'm your daughter, your only daughter. I took care of you. I've been looking after you every single day. This was the moment, the culmination of it all. I reached into the drawer of the side table beside my chair. I pulled out 2 pieces of paper. I laid them on the coffee table, right next to George's folder. One was a copy of her invoice. The other was the canceled check for $24,750. You didn't take care of me, Clara, I said, my voice as cold and clear as ice. You provided a service. You set a price, and I paid that price in full. I tapped the canceled check with my finger. This is the proof. Our financial obligations to one another are complete. We are settled. She stared at the papers, her mind finally connecting the dots. The performance, the frail old woman, the check she thought was her victory, it had all been a lie, a trap, and she had walked right into it. No, she stammered, shaking her head. No. I'll fight this. I'll take you to court. I'll prove you're incompetent, senile, that they manipulated you. She gestured wildly at George. Any attempt to contest the will or the trust will be futile, Clara, George said, his voice cutting through her hysteria. He had seen this 100 times before. Your mother underwent a full psychiatric evaluation with a court-appointed physician before signing these documents. She was found to be of exceptionally sound mind. The paperwork is legally ironclad. You will spend a fortune on legal fees, and you will lose. The fight drained out of her, all at once. Her body seemed to collapse in on itself. She sank back onto the sofa, her face buried in her hands. Sobs racked her body, not the quiet tears of grief, but the ugly, gulping sobs of catastrophic loss. The $2 million, the house, the future she had been so certain of, it all vanished in a puff of legal jargon. How could you? She wailed, looking up at me, her face a mess of tears and smeared makeup. After everything, I'm your family. Family doesn't hand you an invoice, Clara, I said, my voice devoid of anger or triumph. There was only a vast, weary emptiness. You made our relationship a business transaction. I simply finalized the accounting. I stood up. I think this meeting is over. George will show you out. She just sat there, broken, a ruin of her own making. George gently picked up her handbag and held it out to her. She stumbled to her feet, took it without looking at him, and walked out of the room, out of the house, and out of my life, without another word. When the front door closed, the silence that fell was the most peaceful sound I had ever heard. I stood in the middle of my living room, my home, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt completely and utterly free. The audit was over. The books were finally balanced. The click of the front door latch was not an ending. It was a gunshot that signaled the start of a new race. The house was silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. The heavy, oppressive quiet of waiting was gone, replaced by a vast, clean emptiness. It was the silence of a blank page, of an open road. For the first time in over 40 years, my life was entirely my own. There were no more expectations to manage, no more roles to perform. The chains of maternal obligation, which I had worn willingly for so long, and which Clara had tried to reforge in iron, had simply fallen away. In the first few days, I did nothing. I woke when the sun woke me, not when I thought I should be up to answer a potential phone call. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table, the very table where my old life had been handed its death warrant, and I simply listened to the birds outside. I rediscovered the small, quiet rhythms of my own existence. I read books that had been sitting on my shelves for years, their spines uncracked. I listened to music from my youth, vinyl records that hissed and popped with the sound of time. I was not lonely. I was in a state of becoming. I was reintroducing myself to Beatrice. Clara never called. I knew she wouldn't. Her pride, a brittle and ferocious thing, would never allow her to admit defeat or ask for forgiveness. I imagined her cashing that check, the $24,750, feeling like a mountain of cash in one moment and a pittance the next. As the true scale of her loss began to dawn on her, the money would be a constant, bitter reminder, not of what she had gained, but of the $2 million she had forfeited. It was a consolation prize in a game she didn't even know she was playing, and it would poison every purchase. After a week of quiet contemplation, I knew what I had to do. My life was no longer about preserving a legacy for a daughter who didn't want it. It was about building a new one. My visits to the Elm Street Feline Sanctuary changed. I was no longer just a benefactor or a quiet visitor. I became a fixture. I arrived every morning at 9, the same time as the first volunteers. I learned how to clean the cages, how to administer medicine hidden in a piece of tuna, how to gain the trust of a terrified, newly rescued cat who had known only cruelty. My hands, which had once signed stock certificates and trust documents, were now gentle instruments of comfort, brushing matted fur and scratching behind tattered ears. Emily, the bright young volunteer who was now the part-time manager, became the daughter of my heart. We worked side by side, our days filled with the easy chatter and comfortable silences of true friendship. She never asked about my past, about my family. She accepted me for who I was right there, in that moment. Beatrice, the quiet woman who had a magical touch with the most frightened cats. One afternoon, as we were trying to find space for a new litter of kittens that had been found abandoned in a cardboard box, Emily sighed with frustration. We're just out of room, Beatrice. The quarantine area is full. The main colony is at capacity. We'll have to turn others away. I looked around the tired, cramped building. It was clean, it was loving, but it was failing. It was a bucket trying to hold back the sea. Then we'll make more room, I said simply. The next week, I sat down with George and the shelter's board of directors, a small group of dedicated but overwhelmed animal lovers. I didn't tell them the full extent of my wealth, not yet. I simply said I wanted to fund an expansion, a new wing. Their reaction was stunned disbelief, followed by tears of gratitude. I was no longer just a donor, I was a miracle. We hired an architect who specialized in modern, humane animal shelters. I was involved in every detail, from the non-slip flooring to the design of the catio's enclosed outdoor patios where the cats could safely feel the sun on their fur and watch the birds. We designed a state-of-the-art veterinary clinic on site, a quiet, separate wing for senior cats with special needs, and bright, airy rooms for the main colony with climbing trees that reached the ceiling. I called it the Beatrice Vance Wing. It felt right. I was building a home. The years that followed were the happiest of my life. The construction of the new wing gave me a profound sense of purpose. I watched the walls go up, a tangible symbol of my new life rising from the ashes of the old. While the builders worked, Emily and I took trips. We drove to the coast of Maine and ate lobster rolls by the ocean. We flew to England and spent 2 weeks visiting the great gardens of Kent, a trip I had dreamed of my entire life but had always put off for one reason or another. In Emily, I found a travel companion who shared my sense of quiet wonder at the world. She didn't see me as a bank account or a burden. She saw me as a friend. When the new wing opened, it was a local event. The mayor came. The local newspaper sent a photographer. I stayed in the background, watching as families came in, their children's faces alight with joy as they met the kittens. I saw Shadow, the once timid black cat, confidently lounging on a heated perch in the senior wing, finally at peace. That was my dividend. That was my return on investment. I lived for 5 more years after the wing was completed. They were years filled with the sound of purring, the warmth of true friendship, and the deep, unshakable peace of a life lived with purpose. I never heard from Clara again. It was as if she had evaporated, a ghost from a life I no longer recognized. I passed away quietly in my sleep one autumn night at the age of 79. Patches, the old ginger tomcat, was curled up at the foot of my bed. My will was executed by George, cleanly and without complication. The remainder of my estate, as promised, transferred seamlessly to the shelter, ensuring its operation for decades to come. 7 years after my death, a woman pulled a sputtering 10-year-old sedan into a parking space across the street from a bright, modern building. It was a cold November afternoon, and a thin, miserable drizzle was falling. The woman's coat was thin, her face etched with the permanent lines of resentment and fatigue. It was Clara. The $24,750 was long gone, spent on a down payment for a car she couldn't afford and a series of bad investments. Life had not been kind, or perhaps it had been exactly as just as it needed to be. She was on her way to a job interview for a mid-level administrative position she didn't want. Her route had taken her down Elm Street, a part of town she usually avoided. She stopped, staring at the building that now stood where the old, tired shelter used to be. It was beautiful, all glass and warm wood and landscaped gardens. People were coming and going, smiling. She could see a large, open-plan room inside, filled with happy cats and adoring humans. A bitter, acidic feeling rose in her throat. Stupid cats, she thought. All that money wasted on stupid cats. She got out of her car, a morbid curiosity compelling her to walk closer. She didn't know why. Maybe she wanted to fuel her own sense of righteous indignation. As she approached the gleaming glass entrance, something caught her eye. Mounted on the brick wall beside the door was a large, elegant bronze plaque, shimmering even in the dull gray light. She stepped closer to read the inscription: "The Beatrice Animal Home, Est, 2025. This sanctuary was rebuilt and endowed through the boundless generosity of Beatrice Vance, a woman of quiet wisdom who understood that while love can never be bought, it can always be gifted to those most in need of it." Clara read the words once, twice, her breath caught in her chest. It was a monument, not just a building, but a statement. A final, irrefutable declaration of her mother's values, carved in metal for the entire world to see. It was a testament to a legacy she had not only been excluded from, but had never even been smart enough to comprehend. The $2 million was not just money. It was this. It was warmth and light and life, and she had traded it all for the price of a used car. A coldness seeped into her bones that had nothing to do with the November drizzle. It was the chilling, permanent realization of the sheer, catastrophic scale of her miscalculation. She had audited her mother's love and found it wanting, but it was she who had been bankrupt all along. She turned away from the plaque, a hollow ache in her chest, and walked back to her sputtering car. Inside the warm, bright lobby of the Beatrice Animal Home, a young woman with a kind, familiar smile was showing a family a portrait that hung in a place of honor. It was a beautiful oil painting of an older woman with clear, intelligent eyes and a gentle smile. Beatrice, a sleek black cat, was purring on her lap in the painting. "She was our founder," said Emily, who was now the full-time director of the sanctuary. "Our guardian angel. She believed that every life had value, and that kindness was the soundest investment a person could ever make." The father of the family looked at the portrait, then around at the beautiful, peaceful facility. "Well," he said, a look of awe on his face, "her investment certainly paid off." Emily smiled, reaching down to stroke the head of a ginger tomcat with a ragged ear who had rubbed against her leg. "Oh, yes," she said softly, her eyes on Beatrice's portrait. "It did, more than anyone could ever know."